The notice had been fixed to the kitchen door with a single brass tack, and the corners of it had already begun to curl in the damp before anyone in the house dared to read it a second time. It was written in Josiah Crane's own hand, which was small and upright and mean with its ink, and it listed the economies that were to be observed at Greyweather's from that morning onward. 1 fire only, in the room where Mr. Crane himself chose to sit. Candles of tallow, never wax, and those to be counted at the close of each week. No meat above twice in 7 days, and no guests at any hour for guests, the notice said, or an expense dressed up as a kindness. Eleanor Vane read it through in the grey light before dawn, standing in her shawl with her breath showing, and she did not sigh, because sighing wasted warmth. She was 23 that winter, and she had lived at Greyweather's for 11 years, which was long enough to know that a notice pinned to a door was not really about candles at all. It was a way of saying who held the house and who merely lived in it on sufferance. She smoothed the curling corner flat again with one cold finger, not to obey it, but so that the old wolfhound would not tear it down and be beaten for the offence. The dog was called Barrow, and he was grey about the muzzle and slow in his hind legs, and he had been her father's before he was hers. He leaned his weight against her skirts now, the way he did every morning, as if to remind her that some things in the house were still on her side. She rested her hand on the broad flat plane of his skull, and looked past the window at the moor, which lay under a thin skin of frost that would be snow by nightfall. The rooks were up already, turning above the bare elms in a slow black wheel, and their crying carried across the fold like something being counted and found wanting. She had not always risen in the cold to read a stranger's rules on her own door. There had been a time, and she could still summon it if she was careful with the memory, when Greyweather's woke to the smell of new bread and the clatter of a full stable, when her father came down whistling, and the maids sang over the linen, and the fires were laid in every hearth without a thought of counting. Her father had been a gentle, careless man, generous to a fault and hopeless with a ledger, and he had loved her mother past all reason, and lost her to a fever when Eleanor was 7, and after that he had loved his daughter with the whole of a heart that had no other place to spend itself. He taught her to ride, and to read Latin badly, and to sit a horse across the roughest ground on the moor, and he told her 100 times that she was worth more than the whole county put together, and she had believed him, because a child believes her father, and because he had never once given her cause to doubt. Then he too was gone, thrown from a young horse he had no business riding at his years, dead before the doctor could be fetched, and the careless generosity that had made him beloved was found when the men of law came to have left the estate tangled and the accounts in ruin. There was money still, £300 a year settled on Eleanor by her mother's people and safe from her father's debts, but there was no one to manage it, and no one to manage her, and so the law reached out across 2 counties and found Josiah Crane, a cousin by a marriage twice removed, a careful childless man who kept a house in Harrogate and a heart in a strong-box, and it gave into his charge a girl of 12 and a fortune, and told him to do his duty by both. He had done his duty by the fortune. The tightening had come slowly, the way frost comes, so that no single morning was the morning it began. First the singing maids were let go, one by one, for economy. Then the good horses were sold, and Eleanor's own pony with them, though she had begged for that one small thing and been refused. Then the fires were reduced, and the meat and the candles and the guests, until the great house drew in upon itself like a hand closing, and the girl who had ridden the moor freely walked out now only on errands, and asked leave to do even that. Crane did not beat her. He was too careful a man for marks that might be remarked upon. He governed by the withholding of small things and the counting of smaller, and by the steady, quiet reminder, delivered across whatever candle he had permitted, that she was a charge and an expense and a debt of duty he had not asked for and did not enjoy. What he could not take from her, because he did not know it was there to take, was the thing her father had left her that was not money. She kept her back straight, and her word plain, and her small kindnesses secret. She mended gloves for the draper's wife in the town, and hid the shillings in the toe of a stocking, and with them she bought physic for a sick servant, or a paper of tea for old Martha, who had been her nurse, and was now her cook, and was the last soul at Greyweather's who remembered the singing. She read the old books in the shut gallery on the days her guardian was away in Harrogate, standing in her cloak among the covered furniture, turning the pages with careful fingers, because there would be no replacing them. And she loved the old wolfhound Barrow, who was too old to be worth his feed by Crane's accounting, and had been marked more than once for the gun, and whom she had saved each time by giving up her own portion so that his cost the house nothing. These were her riches. She had learned to be rich in a manner Josiah Crane could not audit. Greyweather's had been a handsome house once, in the years when her father was alive, and the rents came in, and the long gallery held its portraits without shame. Now the gallery was shut against the cold, and the portraits looked out at no one, and the rents that should have kept the roof sound went instead into the strong box that Josiah Crane kept beneath the boards of his own chamber. He was her guardian-in-law and her cousin by a marriage 2 removes distant, and when her father died he had come north to take charge of a girl of 12 and a fortune of some £300 a year, and he had never once let her forget which of the 2 he valued. She could have borne the cold. She had borne a great deal that was colder than weather. What she could not grow used to was the slow narrowing of her days, the way each season closed a little tighter than the last, so that a girl who had once ridden the moor on her own pony now walked out only to fetch and carry, and asked leave to do even that. Crane meant her fortune to be added to his own, and there was but one lawful way to reach it, which was to marry her to a man who would sign it over the moment the ring was on her finger. He had found such a man. His name was Mr. Pell, and he dealt in mortgages in the town of Harrogate, and he had a wet mouth and a habit of standing too near. But that is to move ahead of the frost, and the frost came first. On the morning the notice went up, Eleanor did not yet know Mr. Pell's name. She knew only that the pantry was low, and that the physician had said old Martha the cook was not to be let go hungry in her chest cold, and that Crane had said nothing at all when she reported this, which was his way of saying no. So she took the last of her own small store of coin, the few shillings she had saved by mending gloves for the draper's wife, and she wrapped herself against the moor and set out to buy broth meat and a paper of physic, and she did not tell her guardian she was going, because to ask would have been to be refused. The sky came down over the moor like a lid. She had walked that road 100 times, past the standing stone the shepherds called the grey weather, past the dry stone wall that ran to nothing, and she knew every dip of it, but she did not know the storm that was already sliding off the high fell toward her. The first snow came sidelong, fine as flour, and then thicker, and then in great soft handfuls that filled her lashes and took the road away between one step and the next. She should have turned back. She was nearer the town than the house by then, or thought she was, and so she pressed on, and the moor closed white and silent around her, until she could not have said which way lay Greyweather's, and which lay Harrogate, and which lay only the long fall into the beck. It was the horse she heard before she saw anything, a great labouring of hoofs through drift, and a man's voice pitched low and steady against the animal's fear. Then the shape of it loomed out of the whirling white above her, a black hunter foundered to its knees in a hidden ditch, and a rider thrown clear and down on one shoulder in the snow. She did not think. She went to the man because a man down in that weather would be dead by morning, and she got her shoulder under his arm and hauled, and he came up cursing in a voice that was used to being obeyed. He was tall, and even winded and white with cold he carried himself, as though the moor ought to apologise to him for its behaviour. His coat was of a cloth she had not seen in years, close and fine and black, and his gloves were kid, and there was a signet on the hand that gripped her arm that she felt through 2 layers of wool. He looked at her out of a face that gave nothing away, a hard, handsome face gone grey at the edges from the fall, and the first thing he said to her was not thanks. You should not be out in this. A woman alone. It is madness." "So should you then," she answered, "for I do not see your carriage nor your grooms nor any sense at all in you." And she felt him go still with surprise, because plainly no one had spoken to him so in a long while, and then the wind took the exchange and there was no more breath to spare for it. Between them they got the shaking horse up out of the ditch, and she knew the shelter of a fold shed not 200 yards on, a low stone bothy the shepherds used at lambing, and she led them to it half by memory and half by the slope of the ground under the snow. Inside there was old straw and the smell of sheep and a stub of a rushlight in an iron holder that some drover had left, and she had her tinder box in her pocket as she always did, and she got a small mean flame going while he saw to the horse. In that first thin light she saw him properly, and she understood something of who he must be, for there was only one man in the county who wore his arrogance like a birthright, and had lately come north to a house he never used. He was Alaric, Duke of Selby, whose estate at Farrow marched with her father's old land along the beck, and whom the country people called the Frost Duke, because in 3 winters he had spoken to no one and given nothing, and shut himself up alone with whatever it was that ailed him. He caught her looking and named himself, because rank does that even in a sheep shed, and he waited for the change that always came over people when they learned it, the softening, the bending, the little frightened deference. It did not come. She told him her name was Eleanor Vane, and that she was ward to Mr. Crane of Greyweathers, and then she turned her attention to his shoulder, which he was favouring, and told him plainly it wanted looking at, and asked would he sit, or would he be foolish about it. Something moved far back in his eyes at that, not quite amusement, more the memory of what amusement had felt like. They were shut in the bothy above 3 hours while the worst of it blew through, and in those 3 hours they did not become friends, for he had forgotten how. But they did become 2 people who had shared a fire. At first he tried to command her, because commanding was the only speech he had practised in 3 years. He told her to keep back from the horse, to give him the tinder-box, to cease her chatter and let him think. She gave him the tinder-box because it was already lit, and there was nothing to be gained by holding it, and she kept back from the horse because she had more sense than to stand behind a frightened animal, and she ceased none of her chatter at all, because a man half killed with cold needs a voice to hold to more than he needs his own way. She talked of the moor and the shepherds, and the great storm of the year she was 14, when the drifts had reached the second windows, and the sheep were dug out 3 days after by the smell of them. She talked to keep him awake, for she had seen men go quiet and warm and content in the cold and then not wake, and she was not going to let a stranger die in a sheep shed for the want of a little talk. He listened, which he had not meant to. He answered, after a while, which he had meant to still less. He asked her how a gentlewoman came to know the drifts of a storm 10 years gone by the smell of dead sheep, and she told him a girl learns what her hands are for when there is no one left to do a thing but her. He was quiet at that. Then he asked, more gently than he had said anything yet, whether there was truly no one, and she looked at him across the small brave flame and did not answer, which was an answer. Something in his hard face shifted then, some old thing turning over in its sleep, and he did not command her again for the whole of the hours they sat there. When the cold bit deepest, and the horse stood shaking with its head hung low, she told him to give it his coat. He looked at her as though she had told him to give it his title. It is a coat, and there is a beast dying of the cold in front of you, and you have a wall and a fire and good wool beneath this fine cloth, and the horse has nothing but its skin and its terror. He took off the black coat that had cost more than old Martha earned in a 12-month, and laid it over the steaming back of a foundered hunter, and he did it because a girl in a torn petticoat had shamed him into it, and afterward, telling the story to no one for years, he would count it among the first honest things he had done since his brother died. She bound his shoulder with a strip torn from her own petticoat, plain and unembarrassed, and she made him give the horse his own coat over its steaming back. which he did after a look of pure astonishment, and she talked to him not as to a duke, but as to a man who was cold and hurt and too proud to say so. She told him nothing of Mr. Crane's strong-box or the counted candles, but he watched her hands, which were chapped and quick and gentle, and he watched her face in the rushlight, which was thin and grave and lit from within by something he could not name. And when the snow eased at last and she said she must go on for old Martha's broth meat, he found he did not want the flame put out. He would not let her walk. He set her on the tired horse and led it himself the 2 long miles into Harrogate, against every argument she made. And he stood in the street like a servant while she bought her broth meat and her paper of physic, and he spoke not one word of his rank to the draper who gaped at him. Then he led the horse back within sight of Greyweathers, and there she made him stop, for she knew that to be seen returning on a duke's horse would set the whole house talking, and set Crane calculating. And calculation was the last thing she wanted turned toward her. She slid down into the snow and gave him back nothing but a plain word of thanks, and he stood holding the bridle and looking at her as though she were a sum that would not come out. "Why will you not tell me what troubles you? For something does." And she answered that a great many things troubled a great many people, and that his being a duke did not entitle him to the whole of a stranger's confidence in one afternoon, and that he should have his shoulder seen to by a proper surgeon, and not by a girl with a petticoat and good intentions. Then she walked away into the last of the falling snow, and she did not look back, though she wanted to. And behind her the Frost Duke stood a long while in the white road before he mounted stiffly and turned for Farrow. That should have been the end of it. In a fair world it might have been. But the moor is not large, and neither is the number of souls scattered across it, and a man who has been 3 years frozen does not easily forget the first fire that warmed him. In the weeks that followed, the Duke of Selby was seen where he had never been seen before. He was seen at the parish church, in the cold high pew that had stood empty since his coming, and he did not attend to the sermon, but he attended very closely to a certain grave face 2 rows down. He was seen riding the Beckside track that had no purpose but to pass the walls of Greyweathers, and once when old Barrow the wolfhound went lame on a flint and could not walk home, the Duke of Selby got down off his horse in the mud and lifted a filthy elderly dog across his own saddlebow and carried him to Eleanor's very gate, and gave him up into her arms without a word, and rode off before she had finished being astonished. The first time he spoke to her after the day of the storm, it was in the churchyard, in the raw grey cold after the Sunday service, while the congregation filed out between the leaning stones and pretended not to watch. He had come out of the high cold pew that had stood empty 3 years and had sat through the whole of the sermon without hearing one word of it, and now he crossed the trodden snow to where she stood by a low green grave in the far corner, the grave of a careless, generous man who had loved his daughter past reason. He did not know whose grave it was until she told him, and when she told him he took off his hat, which no one had expected, and stood bareheaded in the cold beside the resting place of a bankrupt country gentleman as though it were the tomb of a king. He returned to her the strip of her petticoat, laundered, folded small, wrapped in clean paper, which was an absurd and delicate thing for a duke to have troubled over, and she took it and did not laugh, because she understood that it was not the linen he was returning, but a way of saying he had not forgotten. She asked after his shoulder. He told her it was mended, and she was glad of it, and meant it, and the plainness of her gladness undid him a little, for he was used to women who were glad of his rank and his rent-roll, and never once of his shoulder. They spoke perhaps 3 minutes, of nothing, of the weather and the sermon and the state of the road, and all the while the parish watched from the like gate and drew its conclusions, and Eleanor felt the conclusions settle on her like snow, and knew they would cost her, and could not. Standing there beside her father's grave with the Frost Duke bareheaded at her side, bring herself to mind. After that he was often where she was, though never in a manner she could have named improper. He was on the Beck track when she walked it. He was at the smithy when she brought Barrow to have a thorn drawn from his pad. He was once at the door of the widow Ackroyd's cottage on the Low Fold, where Eleanor had gone with a basket she could ill spare to a woman who had buried a husband and 2 sons and had nothing laid by for the winter. Eleanor did not see him. She was within, on her knees at the poor hearth, coaxing a green fire and dividing out the little she had brought as though it were a great deal, and she did not know that the Duke of Selby had reined in on the track above and sat his horse a long while in the cold, watching a gentlewoman with £300 a year she could not touch give away her own dinner to a woman she was not obliged to help, and asking nothing in return, and not even knowing that she was seen. He said nothing of it to her, then or ever, but the widow Ackroyd woke the next morning to find a cartload of dry-cut wood stacked against her cottage wall, more than she could burn in 2 winters, left in the night by no one anyone could name, and a side of salted pork hung in her cold store, and a purse of coin on the sill wrapped in the same clean paper that a certain strip of petticoat had come home in. The widow wept and gave thanks to God and to the parish and to any Christian soul that had done it, and never learned. And when Eleanor next came with her poor basket and found the widow warm and fed and marvelling, she stood very still in the low doorway and looked at the neat stack of wood cut to a length no local man cut it, and she said nothing either. But a warmth came into her that had nothing to do with the fire, and it frightened her more than the cold ever had. There was a day the beck froze hard enough to walk, and she found him standing out upon the ice like a boy, which she would not have believed of him, prodding at a trapped leaf with the toe of his boot. He looked up when she came, and there was something almost sheepish in his hard face at being caught, and he said the ice put him in mind of a pond at Farrow, where he and his younger brother had skated as children before their father forbade it as beneath them. It was the first time he had named his brother to her, though not the last, and she did not press him, only stood beside him on the black ice, and looked at the leaf caught fast beneath it, green still, held perfect and unrotted in the cold, and after a while she said that some things the cold preserved instead of killing, and he looked at her sharply, as though she had said more than she meant, and perhaps she had. He began to bring her things, small things, in the offhand manner of a man who has never learned how to give and is teaching himself late. A book once out of the great library at Farrow, a volume of poems she had spoken of wanting, and had thought lost when the gallery was shut. And when she said she could not take so fine a thing, he said it did no good shut in a dark room where no one read it. Which was truer than he knew, and made her turn her face away. A packet of good wax candles, another time, left with old Martha at the kitchen door, and Eleanor had lit one in her cold chamber that night, and read the borrowed poems by its steady gold light, and thought of counted tallow, and of a man who gave without counting, and had not been able to say, even to herself, quite what she felt. Once, and only once in all that slow bright winter, they were alone together long enough to say true things. It was at the old pack-horse bridge above the beck, where the track from Farrow crossed the track from Greyweathers, and they met there by an accident that was not entirely an accident, for she had begun to walk that way, and he had begun to ride it, and neither would have owned to it under torture. The light was going amber over the snowfields, and the rooks were coming home, and he got down off his horse to stand beside her at the parapet, and for a while they watched the black water run under the ice without speaking, which was its own kind of speech. He spoke to her then, as he had not spoken to anyone in years, of small things, and then of larger, of Farrow and how empty it was, of the rooms he never entered, of the way a great house can be the loneliest place a man owns. He did not speak yet of the whole of his grief, but she felt the shape of it behind his words the way one feels a room beyond a shut door, and she did not try the handle. She only listened, and let his silences be, and when he had done he looked at her as though her mere listening were a gift no one had offered him in a long while. She did not tell him, that evening, of the marriage her guardian meant to make of her. She should have. But she had felt the amber light and the running water and the low true voice of a proud man laying down a little of his pride, and she had wanted for 1 hour of her narrow life to be simply a woman standing on a bridge with a man who was learning to be kind, and not a ward with a price upon her and a bargain drawing near like the shortening days. So she kept her silence, and it was the one dishonest thing she did in the whole of that winter, and it would cost them both before it was mended. The county talked, as the county will. It said the Frost Duke had thawed, and it wondered at what fire. It did not take Josiah Crane long to hear the talk, and when he heard it a new light came into his small careful eyes, the light of a man who sees an unlooked-for asset in a ledger he had thought he understood. He said nothing to Eleanor of what he had heard. He only watched her more closely, and asked more often where she had been, and one evening he moved Mr. Pell's suit forward with a speed that frightened her, telling her across the counted candle that she was to be married to the mortgage dealer before Lady Day, that the settlements were drawn, that a girl of 23 with no fortune of her own to command had no business refusing a respectable man. She told him the fortune was her own, and she said it quietly, because she had learned that shouting at Crane only fed him. He smiled at that, the way a door smiles when it is a wall. The fortune, he reminded her, was hers only upon a marriage of which he approved, and he approved of Mr. Pell, and until that day it was his to keep and hers to want. And if she thought, he added, watching her narrowly, that some grander gentleman had taken a fancy to her plain grey face, she was a greater fool than her father's daughter ought to be. For great men do not marry the wards of small ones. They merely amuse themselves. And a ruined girl is worth nothing at all, not even to a duke. Eleanor did not answer him. She went up to her cold room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed, with Barrow's heavy head across her knees. And she looked at the truth of her situation as one looks at whether one cannot change. She did not believe the Duke of Selby meant to marry her. She was not a fool, whatever her guardian said. But she had begun, against all sense, to look forward to the sight of him on the beck track, and to save up small true things to tell him, and to feel, when he lifted her lame old dog across his saddle, that somewhere behind the frost there was a man who had once been kind, and might be kind again. That was the danger. Not that he would ruin her, that she had let herself hope. The next time they met by the beck she was more careful with him, and he felt the change and did not like it. He had come to speak of nothing in particular, which was the most he could yet manage, and she answered him in short even sentences and kept her eyes on the ice at the water's edge. At last he asked her outright what had altered, and she told him. She told him she had been reminded that a duke and a guardian's ward could be nothing to one another but a subject of gossip. That gossip cost her dear and cost him nothing, and that it would be kinder in him to ride some other track and let her be forgotten. She said it steadily, and only her hands, twisting in her shawl, betrayed what it cost her to say it. He was quiet a long moment. The beck ran black between its white banks, and the rooks cried overhead. Then he told her, in a low hard voice that seemed dragged up out of some deep place, why he had come north and shut himself away. He had had a brother once, a younger brother, bright and beloved where he himself was cold, and that brother had gone for a soldier and had died in a foreign field of a fever, not even a glorious death, only a stupid wasting one, and the last letter he ever sent had begged Alaric to be less hard, to let people near, to live. And Alaric had folded the letter away and gone on being hard, because it was easier, because a frozen man cannot be hurt again. 3 years he had done it, and then a woman had hauled him out of a ditch in a snowstorm, and scolded him and bound his shoulder with her own petticoat, and not cared a straw that he was a duke. Do not tell me to ride another track. It is the only one on which I have felt alive in 3 years. She should have been strong, she had meant to be. But there are words a woman waits her whole life to be worth, and hears once, and cannot unhear. She stood on the black and white bank of the beck, and let him see her face without any guard upon it. And what he saw there made him step toward her. And for a moment, one moment out of a life of frost, it seemed the whole difference of their stations might simply dissolve like the snow into the running water. Then a shepherd's dog barked far off across the fold, and she came to herself, and the moment closed, and she told him gently that feeling alive was not the same as being free, and that she was not free, and that until she was he must not say such things to her, because they would break them both. She told him then of Mr. Pell, and of the settlements drawn, and of the strong-box beneath the boards. She had not meant to. It came out of her because he had given her his brother, and a confidence answers a confidence. She watched his face change as she spoke, watched the old frost come back over it, but this time she understood that it was not coldness turned toward her, but rage turned toward another, held rigidly in check, because a duke does not shout on a public track. When she had finished he answered only that she must not marry Mr. Pell, and she answered that wanting a thing and having it were different countries, and that she had no coin to cross between them. And he looked at her as though he were making a decision that had been 3 years in the coming, and, very low, he bade her leave the crossing to him. Mr. Pell came to Greyweather's that same week, driven out from Harrogate in a hired chaise, to look over what he was buying. That was how Eleanor thought of it, standing in the cold drawing-room in her one good gown, while her guardian presented the mortgage dealer with the air of a man displaying sound stock at a fair. Mr. Pell was a wide, soft man with a wet mouth and small, quick eyes, and he wore a coat too new and a ring too large, and he looked at Eleanor as he might have looked at a parcel of land, running his glance over her from hem to hair and finding her, she saw, adequate to his purpose and no more. He stood too near her at the window. He spoke to Crane about her as though she were not in the room, of her age, which he allowed was a little advanced, and her fortune, which he allowed made up for it, and of the improvements he would make to a girl who had plainly been let run wild in the north, with no proper hand upon her. Eleanor answered him civilly, because she had been taught that a lady is civil, and she poured the tea Crane had for once permitted, and she felt, with each soft wet word the man let fall, something in her setting, hard and cold and final, like water turning to ice on the beck. She thought of the Duke of Selby standing bareheaded at her father's grave. She thought of the widow's firewood cut in the dark, and of a leaf held green and perfect beneath the ice, and of a proud man saying he had felt alive on no track but the one that led to her. And she understood, pouring tea for Mr. Pell, that she would sooner walk out onto the moor in a storm, with nothing than let this man's ring be put upon her finger, and that the only question left to her was not whether she would refuse, but what refusing would cost, and who would pay it. Crane saw the change in her, for he missed very little where his interests lay, and it did not please him. When the chaise had carried Mr. Pell away into the dusk, he came to her in the cold hall, and told her the man was well satisfied, that the settlements wanted only her signature and the reading of the banns, that she might count herself fortunate a respectable tradesman would take a portionless girl of 23 off his hands. She said the girl was not portionless, that the portion was her own. He smiled the smile that was a wall, and she saw in that smile that he had heard the county's talk of the Frost Duke after all, that he was hurrying the thing forward precisely because he feared she had a better hope, and that a man who has decided to sell a thing quickly does so because he suspects it may soon be worth more than he can keep. But Josiah Crane was not a man to be outflanked by a look on a track. He had eyes among the servants, or ears at least, and he learned that his ward had been seen once more with the Frost Duke, and had come home with her cheeks bright and her step light. And this frightened him, because a girl in love is a girl who will not marry Mr. Pell, and a girl who will not marry Mr. Pell is £300 a year walking out the door. So he moved to close the trap while it could still be closed. He gave out that the wedding to Mr. Pell would take place within the week. He forbade Eleanor the moor and the church and the very gate, and when she stood before him white and steady and told him she would not marry the mortgage dealer, that she would rather go out on the moor with nothing. He showed her at last the whole of what he was. Then go. His voice was flat and pleased. There is the door, and there is the moor, and there is the night coming down. But understand me. If you set foot outside this house tonight, if you go to whatever fine friends you imagine you have made, you do not come back. I will not have a girl under my roof who defies me and then crawls home when the cold bites. You will return by morning or not at all. And if you are not returned by morning, having thought better of your folly and consented to Mr. Pell, then the door of Greyweathers is shut against you forever, and your name is struck from this family. And you may see how far a ruined woman's dignity carries her across the world. He said it certain of his victory, for what could she do? She had no money he had not counted, no horse he had not sold, no roof but the one he had just threatened to close. He expected her to weep and stay. He turned back to his ledger, dismissing her. Eleanor stood in the cold hall of Greyweathers, and understood that she had come to the edge of her whole life. The snow was beginning again beyond the windows, the same fine flower that had heralded the great storm weeks before. To go out was to risk the moor and lose the only home she had. To stay was to be sold to Mr. Pell by Lady Day, and to lose herself, which was worse. And in that hall, with old Barrow pressed shaking against her skirts and her guardian's pen scratching in the next room, she found that the choice was not a choice at all. She wrapped herself against the moor as she had done once before. She kissed the old dog's grey head and told him to keep by the kitchen fire that Crane had not yet troubled to forbid, and she opened the door of Greyweathers and walked out into the falling dark, with nothing, toward the only fire she knew. The 2 miles to Farrow were longer in the dark than the 2 into Harrogate had ever been by day, and the snow was thickening, and more than once she went down to her knees in a drift, and thought that the moor would after all be her answer, that she would be found stiff in the white by the shepherds at lambing beside the Greyweather stone. But she got up each time, because there was a light ahead of her now, and it was not the moon. It was a single window burning gold across the white waste, the window of a man who 3 years had let no light show, and she went toward it the way the frozen go toward warmth, past sense, past strength, on the last of her will. There were moments on that walk when she forgot why she was walking, when the cold got into her thinking and turned it slow and strange, and she found herself talking aloud to her father as though he walked beside her, and to Barrow, whom she had left warm by the fire, and once to the Greyweather stone itself, which loomed up out of the snow like a hooded shepherd, and then fell behind. The wind came off the fell and cut through her wool as though it were muslin, and the drifts dragged at her skirts, and twice she went down and lay a moment in the soft white, and felt how easy it would be to stay, how the cold that had been her enemy all her life might be at the last a kind of mercy. But each time she thought of the gold window burning across the waste, and of the man who had let no light show in 3 years, and now sat up alone every night behind a single flame, and she got her knees under her and rose, because she had not walked away from Mr. Pell's soft wet certainty in order to lie down and die on the moor and let her guardian tell the county she had run mad. She would reach the light or she would not, but she would go toward it on her feet. She fell against the great door of Farrow and beat on it with hands she could no longer feel, and it was opened not by a footman, but by the Duke of Selby himself, who had been sitting up alone as he did every night, and who looked at the snow-caked, shivering figure on his step, and did not for one instant fail to know her. He drew her in. He did not ask her what had happened, for the state of her told him, and the hour told him, and her guardian's cruelty he could read plain in the fact that she had come to him with nothing at all. He put his own coat about her a second time. He shouted for fires and hot wine and the housekeeper, and the great cold house that had been silent 3 years came suddenly, wonderfully alive with running feet and light. And when she could speak, when the worst of the shaking had passed, and the blood had come back into her hands, she told him what her guardian had said. Return by morning, or not at all. She told it plainly, without weeping as she told everything, but her voice shook on the last words, for she understood their meaning better than Crane had. She could not go back. There was nowhere for her to go. She had crossed the moor to the one house in the county where she was wanted, and in doing so she had made herself, in the world's cold eyes, a ruined woman, a girl who had spent a night alone under a duke's roof, and no explanation would ever quite scrub the stain away. She had chosen her own destruction over Mr. Pell's bed, and she did not repent it. But she saw what it was. The Duke of Selby heard her out. Then he stood, and something in him that had been frozen 3 winters and thawing 3 weeks came at last wholly and finally to life. He said her guardian had spoken more wisely than he knew. She would indeed not go back by morning. She would never go back at all, because by morning she would not be Miss Eleanor Vane, ward and dependent, whom the world might ruin at its leisure. She would be the Duchess of Selby, whom the world would not dare. He would not have her stand in his hall 1 hour longer under a shadow he could lift with a word. He sent his fastest man on his fastest horse through the snow to the parsonage, with a purse and a message, and the parson came, muffled and blinking and astonished, before the tall clock in the hall had struck 11, while they waited for the parson she had tried, once, to give him a way out of it. She stood before the great fire in her travelling wool, with her hair drying in the heat, and told him that he need not do this, that he might shelter her the night, and see her safe in the morning to some cousin or some school, that a duke marrying a guardian's ward in the dark would be talked of the length of the county, and might be talked of to his hurt, and that she would not have him ruin himself to save her. He heard her out. Then he took her cold face between his 2 hands, gently, as though it was something that might break, and told her that he had spent 3 years being careful of his name and his heart and his peace, and that being careful had very nearly killed him by inches in a house full of no one, and that he would very much rather be talked of the length of the county as a man who had married for love, than praised the length of it as a man who had let love walk back out into the snow. She had no answer to that. She had never in her life had anyone insist upon her worth against her own protests, and it undid something in her that had been held tight for 11 years, and she wept then, once, briefly, into his coat, and he held her and did not tell her to stop. There was no time for bans, and no wish for them, and a duke may have his licence and his way when he is determined, and Alaric, Duke of Selby, had never in his life been more determined of anything. They were married that night in the great hall at Farrow, by the light of the wax candles that Josiah Crane had forbidden and Alaric had ordered lit by the dozen, so that the long dark room blazed gold from end to end, and the frost on the tall windows ran to water in the sudden warmth. The parson read the words over them in a voice unsteady, with the strangeness of the hour. The housekeeper wept into her apron. 2 footmen and a groom and old Martha's own nephew, who was a stable hand at Farrow, stood witness, and they fell silent, every one, when the Duke of Selby, who had spoken to no one in 3 years, took the cold chapped hand of a girl who had walked 2 miles through the snow with nothing, and held it in both of his as though it were the whole of his fortune, and made his vows to her in a low clear voice that carried to the farthest shadow of the hall. She wore no white and no jewels. She wore a borrowed shawl over her travelling wool, and her hair was still damp from the snow, and there was no ring in the house that would answer, so he took the signet from his own hand, the one she had felt through the wool in the ditch, and set it on her finger where it hung loose and heavy and warm. And when the parson said the last of it, when he named them man and wife in the blazing candlelight, the Duke of Selby did not kiss her at once, as another man might. He lifted her hand, the one with his ring on it, and he pressed his mouth to her cold knuckles the way a man does who has been given back something he thought lost forever, and only then did he raise his head and look at her, and let her see, plain and unguarded before all the witnesses, the whole of what she had thawed. The candles burned, the snow fell soft against the glass, and Eleanor Vane, who had gone out into the dark with nothing, stood married in the light with everything. Josiah Crane came to Farrow the next morning, as she had known he would, with the law he thought he owned. He came in his gig through the drifts with Mr. Dunn, Pell beside him, and a great deal to say about wards and consent and settlements, and the disgrace of a girl who ran off in the night. He said it all in the great hall, loudly, until the Duke of Selby came down the stair and let him finish, and then told him, quite without heat, that he was addressing the Duchess of Selby, that the marriage was lawful and witnessed and beyond his reach, and that the matter of Miss Vane's fortune, £300 a year kept back these 11 years in a strong-box under the floor, would now be examined very closely indeed by lawyers who answered to Farrow and not to Harrogate. Crane's face, when he understood, went the colour of tallow. Mr. Pell was already backing toward the door, and Eleanor, standing on the stair in a gown that fitted her, with a ring that was hers, watched her guardian shrink in the light of the house he had thought too grand ever to shelter her, and felt not triumph, for she was not made for triumph, but only a great quiet settling, like snow ceasing to fall. She came down the last of the stair then, and crossed the hall, and stood before Josiah Crane, who had governed the whole of her life with counted candles and withheld small things, and she found that she was not afraid of him, and never need be again. She thanked him in a level voice for his notice of the household economies, for she had learned from it exactly how little a person might be made to live upon, and how much might be taken from them under the name of duty, and she meant to remember it all her days, and to spend the rest of her life doing the opposite. Crane opened his mean small mouth and shut it again. Mr. Pell had already found the door, and the Duke of Selby, watching his wife face down the man who had tried to sell her, thought that he had never in his life seen anything he admired more, and told her so, later, when they were alone. The fortune came back to her in time, every counted shilling of it, though by then she had no need of it, and gave the most of it to old Martha and to the shepherd's widows, and to the parish that had a cold high pew standing empty no longer. Greyweathers she never lived in again, but she did not let it fall. She sent men to mend the roof and open the long gallery and hang the portraits where the light could reach them, and she kept old Barrow by her own fire at Farrow until his grey muzzle went white, and he died at last in his sleep on the hearthrug, warm, which was all she had ever wanted for him. The Frost Duke was not called the Frost Duke any longer. The county could not think why it ever had. In the first weeks of the marriage they were, in truth, half strangers to one another, for a night wedding by candlelight leaves a great deal unsaid, and they had come to it out of a storm rather than a courtship. But they had the whole of a winter to learn, and Farrow, which had been shut and silent, opened room by room as she moved through it, and the fires that Alaric had never troubled to have lit in chambers he never entered were lit now. And the great house that had been the loneliest place he owned became, slowly and without either of them quite marking the day, a home. She would find him watching her across a room with an expression he did not know he wore, the look of a man who cannot yet believe the thaw will hold, and she would go to him and put her hand in his, the one with the heavy signet still upon it, for he had never asked for it back and she had never offered, and the touch was enough, more than enough, for two people who had each spent so long learning to want nothing. The county, which had waited to see which way the thing would fall, fell over itself to have been on the side of romance all along. The older women who had known Eleanor's mother said they had told everyone how it would be, and the younger ones who had predicted scandal said nothing and sent their cards. And when the new Duchess of Selby was seen driving out in a good carriage with a lap-robe over her knees and old Barrow's grey head resting on the seat beside her, the same people who had counted her ruined a month before bowed very low indeed, and Eleanor bowed back, civil to all of them, and remembered every one. On the first anniversary of that strange bright night, when the snow came again off the high fell and filled the beck and took the road away, Eleanor stood at the tall window of the great hall at Farrow with her husband's arm about her and watched it fall. On the sill before them a single candle burned, a wax one, lit not from need but from remembrance, and its small steady flame stood doubled in the dark glass against the whirling white beyond. She thought of the notice curling on the kitchen door, of the counted candles, of the voice that had told her to return by morning or not at all. She had not returned by morning. She had not returned at all. And looking at the light standing firm against the storm, at the man who had crossed 3 years of frost to reach her as surely as she had crossed 2 miles of snow to reach him, she understood that some doors are shut only so that a better one may open, and that the coldest houses are sometimes the ones with the most warmth waiting, banked and hidden, for the one hand brave enough to feed it. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.